So I have three kind of categories for these, the relationship between the development of postmodernism out of liberalism. I have the philosophical category, the psychological category, and the spiritual and moral category. Mm-hmm. So feel free to just interrupt me at any point and give your thoughts, or I'll just sort of like list what I think is some relevant points. So in the philosophical category, I kind of wrote a bunch of these down just off the top of my head. So we talked about, one of them is that liberalism is inherently deconstructive, and this, you can see this as kind of an extension of that. Another is that egalitarianism, as I said, divorced from kind of a coherent view of the universe, a hierarchical view, especially that Catholicism offers. It has no logical endpoint, really, because it can never be fully achieved. Reality will always rebel. And so that is part of the reason you get this this increasing rebellion, this increasing acedia, this increasing refusal to accept kind of the givenness of our natures. And so that gets to the spiritual aspect as well.
But maybe we could stop there for a moment, because I think that's exactly where liberalism and postmodernism are extremely similar to one another. This desire for often a very kind of radical sort of rejection of limits. There should be no limits of any kind. I think Pluckrose and Lindsay, in that they kind of appeal to science, want to say, well, the difference between liberalism and postmodernism is that liberalism recognizes the limits that science tells us exist. So, for example, they want to defend the biological differences between men and women. But science also gives us lots of tools to overcome limits, and we've seen that in all kinds of obvious ways. Medicine, for example, mathematical ways to build buildings taller and more strongly, and all of this kind of stuff. And so it's a desire to break limits, to reject any kind of limit that I think is shared between the two. And Patrick Deneen kind of talks about this in his book and suggests that that's at the very heart of liberalism, this rejection of limits. And boy, you look at postmodernism and you read Pluckrose and Lindsay, that is the definition of postmodernism as well.
Liberal universalism and equality downplays meaningful differences between sexes and cultures, etc. So social justice paradoxically returns focus to those differences, but not in the traditional sense. Instead, it kind of denies any meaning to them except for one based on oppression and power relations. So there is a sort of legitimate rebellion against the kind of deconstruction of identity that liberalism already does by being so kind of monolithically humanistic, universalistic, globalist kind of thing. But it doesn't really, like with the spiritual thing we talked about, it doesn't really return to meaningful categories. It kind of reduces everything to oppression.
Yeah, I think Pluckrose and Lindsay talk about this in some detail in the book, how, in their view at least, a liberal has individuals and it has universality, right? It has individual humans and it has humanity. But there's nothing in between. At least nothing in between that has any value. And postmodernism, their accusation is at least that postmodernism has only the between, right? There are racial categories, there are sexes, there are, fat people and thin people, if you want to go to fat studies and all of this kind of thing. And what I think we certainly see in a very distinct Catholic contribution to this debate are principles like subsidiarity, where there are individuals and there is all of humanity, but there are also all kinds of other orders that exist and that we are able to find ourselves in and to tend to
which we can freely admit are constructive to some extent,
Sure. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, being a college teacher, sometimes I will hear a student say, well, that's socially constructed. But what they really mean by that is it's not real, and therefore I can just reject it.
Right.
Just because something's socially constructed doesn't mean it's not real, and it doesn't mean that we can do away with it, and it doesn't mean that we should do away with it.
Right. So finally, in the philosophical category, we have this kind of rejection of the tyranny of science. But again, this doesn't really go in. There's a certain desire to have a more expansive understanding of knowledge and the human experience, but it doesn't really go in the direction of truth. It more goes in the direction of relativism rather than a fuller embrace of the truth, because they've already decided that kind of any universal or objective truth is tyrannical in itself. Mm-hmm. So then we go to the psychological reasons. I would just say liberalism makes people miserable and it destabilizes society in ways that damage people's mental health. And so I think that, in very direct ways, I don't mean liberalism as a philosophy so much, although that's part of it, as the consequences of liberalism. I mean, the destabilization of the family, of communities, these things where people can understand the meaning of life in a very intuitive way have been lost. So there's already a detachment from reality. At the very beginning of the book, actually, now that I think of it, they mention a thinker, Baudrillard, who I'm not very familiar with, but they talk about how the progress from like kind of modernity to postmodernity, modernity kind of initiates this kind of copying, this, like, I guess he's talking about mass production, copying of reality. And then in postmodernity, you get, I'm probably butchering this, but you get like copies of copies until we're finally detached from what's authentic and what's original. And I think that maybe that might not be a totally helpful framework in every case, but in any case, it's clear that it becomes very difficult to connect people with spiritual realities or universal realities when the particular has been so destroyed. And if somebody has no experience of, just to put it at a very basic level, of fatherhood, then it's going to be difficult to have a sense of fatherhood as something that is not illusory or oppressive or non-existent. I mean, that's just one example.
Yeah, in that liberalism, I think Pluckrose and Lindsay are right here. It's about individuals and it's about all of humanity. Liberalism tends to do rather poorly. It has a lot of difficulties with anything in between those two, such as the family. What does liberalism, which presumes adults, it presumes sort of autonomous adults, what does it do with dependents, people who are dependent? And it's just not really sure what to do with them. And so there can be a lot of confusion and a lot of processes that undermine exactly the ability to care for dependent people, whether they're the elderly, the sick, the very young, etc.
Yeah. So, the universal, just to take human nature as one example, the universal and the kind of idea of one big human family, that's mediated through the actual experience of family. This is a very old conservative point to make. I'm sure Chesterton said it, that you talk about people who love humanity but don't love the people who are in their immediate vicinity. And that kind of idea of diversity, dealing with diversity in a real sense, that is an experience that you have in the family. It's an experience that you have in smaller communities, and it's an experience that you have even in relatively homogenous communities and families. So when you lose those practical experiences, then these kind of liberal kind of abstract philosophical ideas become increasingly nominal and kind of virtue signally, for lack of a better phrase.
For liberals, everything needs to be subjected to individual choice. Right? So it's not so much, I am a father. That is an objective fact. Now, what does a good father do? And therefore, to be a good father means I need to do those things. For liberalism, it's, it's a choice. Do you want to be a father? Do you not want to be a father? Pluckrose and Lindsay say this quite a lot, right? When they want to critique postmodernism, they often have these little caveats. Well, if that's what you want to do, right, it's okay to do it. They reveal the importance of choice at the very heart of liberalism. And obviously some choices are good, and we want to have freedom to make certain kinds of choices. But liberalism isn't very good at telling us what are good choices and what are bad choices. What choices should we have? What choices should we not have? It's just an ever-expanding menu of choices, which feeds into lots of things like consumerism, right? Well, it's better to have 1,000 different brands of toothpaste than 10 brands of toothpaste, just because 1,000 is more than 10, more choice. There's very little ability to engage in the actual human experience, I think, of choice and of not choice, of role, of participation in community. Obviously, the church talks about the body of Christ, and every little part of the body has a role to play. And every role is an important role, but it's important because you're in the role. And liberalism, to the extent that it just is not very interested in lots of these intermediary institutions and promotes practices and beliefs that undermine those institutions, is going to be really damaging.
So the final psychological point, and this relates back to the philosophical, is that liberal universalism destabilizes people's sense of group identity. So there's an unfulfilled desire to participate in a collective, which manifests itself pathologically. And I think this kind of goes against the idea you often hear, is that liberals bemoan the regression of identity politics towards group identity, away from individualism and kind of the universal human race. And that's true only insofar as these are pathological group identities. But otherwise, it wouldn't be true. I mean, it just depends. I mean, you can have group identity without having tribalism in the worst sense.
Sure.
So I think that there's a necessary balancing out. I mean, I think we can see that the liberal order has achieved some pretty impressive things in terms of people's ability of very different backgrounds to live together, but at certain costs of homogenization. So I think that there needs to be a balancing out. And I don't really see someone like James Lindsay addressing that, because they have a very kind of thin libertarian view of human nature.
Yeah, I mean, this is a critique of liberalism that goes way back. Marx was making similar kinds of observations about liberalism, and to the extent that it's kind of integrated with capitalism, that it creates atomization, it creates alienation. People have a lack of meaning in their lives, much of which is because they have a lack of connection to anything that goes beyond themselves. Unless, the liberal response is, well, just choose something, right? Choose something that seems meaningful to you, which is easier said than done. And when one looks at the expanding range of choices and the fact that it doesn't seem to make people any happier, it seems to make them actually less happy. We see, I think, some of these psychological flaws in liberalism.
So finally, we get to kind of the spiritual and moral aspects, and we've touched on some of this already. I think liberalism is an ideology based on pride, and to some extent envy, but I think that's more of a result of pride. And these are just, in a practical sense, these are vices that become habituated, and you can't really expect them to be satisfied with some kind of ideological resting place. You can't. The nature of vices, they don't just rest in a rational end. We've now accomplished liberty and equality, so we don't need to fight for those things anymore. I don't need to elevate myself anymore. And the same can be said for anger, which is very characteristic of these postmodern activists in particular.
Yeah, I mean, pride is sort of, I think, the very centerpiece of liberalism, a sense that, in some ways, self-love is not an inherently negative thing, right? We are to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. But this sense of autonomy and independence, that dependence itself is a bad thing, and that what the purpose of human life is to become as independent as possible, I think is really very much at the root of liberalism. It's one of its fundamental values.
Right. Yeah. So this goes along with a demonic element, I think. I've been becoming more aware of the kind of explicitly satanic aspects of early liberalism, and particularly in France. Where some liberal thinkers were very explicitly referring to Satan as a model in some ways, whether they meant it in a kind of religious sense or a literary sense, I don't think matters very much to Satan. You see that too, to some extent with postmodernism, not so much Satanism, but some people have been pointing out aspects of the occult in Black Lives Matter, the organization, and various other aspects of kind of one way you could put it is that if all sources of knowledge are being validated as equal to or as against scientific knowledge, then, as the authors point out, that includes things like witchcraft. And so all of these things are very kind of present together in a mush, so that you have witchcraft as one of many possible avenues for self-exploration and self-assertion. Of course, this is just a part of. This is nothing new, really, with liberalism. But I guess I'm just pointing out that there is that aspect as well, to the kind of pathology of these worldviews.
Yeah, a revolt, if you will, against the church is part of the history of liberalism. That's historically the great enemy that liberals and liberalism identified was the Catholic Church. That's just an empirical historical fact.
Even in places where the Catholic Church had not been in power for a century or two,
or even more,
the Catholic Church was still seen as the greatest threat. Even in among like English Protestants, I think.
Absolutely. Look at British history, right? It was Catholicism in the instance, if you will, of Spain. Spain is sort of the great opposite, the great evil, and less so here in America, just because there weren't a lot of Catholics to be afraid of, I guess. But you just read some of the early documents that lead up to the American Revolution, and there's all kinds of fears about Quebec, right, which is just been recently taken over by the British, and the tolerance of the Catholic Church in what's now Quebec. So this goes all the way back. It's in the very roots of liberalism. But I wonder if we could expand it out a little bit and say that maybe it is just fundamentally part of modernity itself, because Marx has all kinds of depictions, if you will, of Prometheus, and Prometheus is a hero for Marx. Right. What does Prometheus do? Right, he steals fire from the gods and gives it to mankind. So it are these figures who go to war against the gods or God, and are the enemy of God, and put man and God as enemies to one another. These are heroes. In modern ideologies, whether it's liberalism or Marxism or others, I'm sure we could think of.
Yeah, well, I just did a whole episode about Marx and how his many of his writings are his literary writings are explicitly satanic. Actually, there's.
Yeah, I think there is. The question then becomes, right, what does Marx or what does any particular writer mean by Satan?
Sure.
And then what's sort of, from a Catholic perspective, the reality of that? But sure, to the extent that the church and God are very concepts of a God is something to be overthrown and destroyed. Yeah, Satan is going to be at the very least a symbol that they'll happily embrace, because Satan is the great enemy of God.
So finally, and this is really just kind of a truism, liberalism by its nature allows for all kinds of wicked behavior, and I think this has been proven to be true in the past several decades in particular, that simply having tolerance is not really going to be satisfactory to people. This has been shown to be true, especially in the gay rights movement. Simply getting your goals of tolerance and equality is not going to be sufficient. So the Bible says multiple times that the wicked cannot tolerate even the sight of a righteous man. Even the sight of a righteous man is a reproach to the wicked. So that's going to be a reason that these ideologies can't stop with simply being liberal in the literal sense of that word. Also, as we talked about before, this rejection of limits, I mean, natural law and human nature itself reminds them that their behavior is wrong. If we're talking about, whether we're talking about, avarice or, but especially, sexual misbehavior. So human nature, and in a way, being itself, the very notion of truth has to be increasingly suppressed or mutilated in various ways. So I think that's another spiritual thing going on here, that you can't escape God, and you can't escape the reality of your own nature. So the deconstruction, just like you can't escape meaning and language, and so the deconstruction of language has to go on forever. Mm-hmm. I think there's a similar dynamic going on here with human nature, with morality. So I think that that's just a truism of any situation where what's that expression? Whatever the expression is, what is allowed will soon become mandatory, something like that.
I don't know exactly the phrase, but I know the one you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we see explicitly in postmodernism a kind of cultural relativism, and we see it, at least I think implicitly and sometimes explicitly, in liberalism, in its real reluctance and oftentimes, right, in somebody like John Rawls, right, its absolute refusal to endorse a vision of the good. Right, this claim that, well, all, or at least most, right, visions of the good can be incorporated into liberalism, but liberalism itself doesn't have one. And I think this is toward the goal of expanding choice and expanding autonomy. And ultimately, right, it diminishes, I would say, our anthropology, right? What is a human being? I think at the fundamental level, what liberalism says is a human being is a choice agent. And that's about it. They don't have a whole lot more to say, or at least that's the core of it. There's nothing more in the essence of a human being than this thing, whatever that thing is that makes choices. And it's very threadbare. It's very thin, and it doesn't give direction. It essentially says, well, pretty much any choice is as good as any other choice. And so perhaps no surprise that we wind up with the kinds of cultural situations that we're in the United States, certainly now, when that core of liberalism is, as I was arguing earlier, kind of Christianity and especially historically Protestant Christianity has kind of ebbed away. And now there is nothing left in the center because liberalism doesn't want there to be a center.